History rarely announces the moment it almost ends. There are no alarms, no headlines, only quiet decisions made behind closed doors. And sometimes, those decisions depend on a single person inside the system who understands what others cannot see. In the early 1980s, the world stood closer to nuclear war than most people would ever realize. Not because anyone wanted it, not because a leader pressed a button in anger, but because fear, misunderstanding, and silence began to align. At the center of that alignment stood a man who was never meant to be there. His name was Oleg Gordievsky, and for years he lived a life built entirely on trust. Trust from the Soviet Union, trust from the KGB, trust from the very system that would destroy him if it ever learned the truth. Gordievsky was not born an outsider. He was raised inside the Soviet intelligence world. His father served in the NKVD, the organization that later evolved into the KGB. At home, loyalty to the state was not debated, it was assumed. The Soviet Union was not an abstract concept, it was the framework of life itself. From an early age, Gordievsky learned discipline, obedience, caution, silence. These were not lessons taught formally, they were absorbed through observation. In the Soviet system, asking the wrong question could define your future. Gordievsky excelled. He was intelligent, methodical, politically reliable, exactly the kind of person the KGB wanted. Joining Soviet intelligence was not viewed as betrayal of personal freedom. It was viewed as service to something larger. To the outside world, the KGB represented repression and control. Inside the Soviet Union, it represented protection. Protection from enemies, protection from chaos, protection from collapse. At least that was the story Gordievsky was taught to believe. For years, he believed it. He studied foreign languages, learned the mechanics of espionage, trained to observe without being seen. Secrecy was not a burden, it was a responsibility. Nothing in Gordievsky's early career suggested rebellion. He did not challenge authority. He did not question ideology. He did not express doubt. To his superiors, he appeared reliable. To the system, he was invisible in the best possible way. That invisibility would later make him dangerous, but at the time, it made him valuable. Gordievsky's first foreign postings were treated as privileges. Travel outside the Soviet Union was rare. Those who were selected were monitored closely. Every action observed, every conversation evaluated. Gordievsky passed these tests without incident. He returned home exactly as expected. To Moscow, he was loyal. To himself, he was still certain. The transformation did not begin with anger. It did not begin with betrayal. It began with exposure. When Gordievsky was posted to Western Europe, he did not enter enemy territory. He entered something far more unsettling: normality. There were no armed guards on street corners, no propaganda slogans dominating public spaces. People criticized their government openly, and nothing happened to them. At first, Gordievsky dismissed what he saw. Appearances could be misleading. Capitalist societies, he believed, hid their control more skillfully. But the longer he stayed, the harder that explanation became to sustain. What unsettled him most was not politics, it was access. In the West, Gordievsky could walk into bookstores without restriction, libraries without supervision, universities without ideological oversight. He could read opposing viewpoints, listen to debates, and counter contradiction. For the first time, information was not filtered, and that raised an uncomfortable question. If the West was as oppressive as Soviet ideology claimed, why did it allow so much openness? These doubts did not turn into action. Not yet. Gordievsky did not defect. He did not seek contact with Western intelligence. He continued to serve the KGB exactly as expected. But something had changed. A gap had formed between belief and experience. And once that gap appears, it never truly closes. What Gordievsky did not yet understand was how dangerous that gap would become, not only for him, but for the entire world. Because in a system built on certainty, doubt is not just a weakness, it is a fault line. And in the years that followed, that fault line would widen, quietly, relentlessly, until it reached the very core of the Cold War.
Oleg Gordievsky did not grow up imagining rebellion. He did not dream of defiance. He did not question authority. From the beginning, his world was defined by the state. Gordievsky was born into Soviet intelligence culture. His father served in the NKVD, an organization that later evolved into the KGB. At home, the state was not an abstraction. It was present in daily life. Loyalty was not debated. It was expected. In post-war Soviet society, identity came before individuality. You were taught who you were by the system that raised you. For Gordievsky, that identity was clear. He was meant to serve. The Soviet Union did not describe itself as oppressive. It described itself as necessary. Necessary to defend socialism, necessary to prevent chaos, necessary to protect the revolution from enemies. To a young man raised inside that worldview, the logic made sense. Gordievsky absorbed it fully. He studied hard, followed rules, avoided attention. He learned quickly that safety came from conformity. In the Soviet system, deviation was remembered. When Gordievsky entered intelligence training, nothing felt contradictory. He learned foreign languages, studied political theory, trained in surveillance and countersurveillance. Secrecy was framed as discipline. Control was framed as stability. Espionage, as it was taught, was defensive. The West was hostile. Capitalism was aggressive. The KGB existed to maintain balance. This narrative did not feel extreme. It felt responsible. In his early career, Gordievsky saw no reason to doubt it. He performed well. He followed procedure. He earned trust. His first assignments abroad reinforced his status. Travel outside the Soviet Union was rare and closely monitored. Those who failed to conform were quietly removed. Gordievsky did not fail. He returned to Moscow exactly as expected. No incidents, no questions.
To his superiors, he was dependable. To himself, he still believed. The first cracks did not appear through confrontation. They appeared through comparison. In the early 1960s, Gordievsky was posted to Copenhagen. Denmark was not chaotic, not hostile, not visibly oppressed. It was orderly, calm, predictable. There were no soldiers on the streets, no slogans painted on walls, no visible fear. People spoke openly, and nothing happened to them. At first, Gordievsky dismissed this. Appearances could deceive. Western societies, he believed, hid their control behind comfort and prosperity. But that explanation weakened over time. What unsettled him most was not what people said, it was what they were allowed to say. In Copenhagen, Gordievsky could enter bookstores freely. He could read newspapers that disagreed with each other. He could hear criticism of the government without consequence. This was not what he had been taught to expect, and that contradiction stayed with him. Still, Gordievsky did not reject the Soviet system. Not yet. Doubt remained internal, contained. That changed in 1968. That year, Soviet forces entered Czechoslovakia to suppress the Prague Spring. Officially, it was a defensive action, a necessary intervention to prevent counter-revolution. But the images told a different story. Unarmed civilians confronting tanks, students pleading with soldiers, a reform movement crushed by force. For Gordievsky, this moment mattered, because the Prague Spring was not capitalist, it was socialist. It was reform from within the system. Watching a socialist government destroy a socialist reform movement forced a reckoning.
If the system required violence against its own people to survive, what exactly was being protected? This question did not make Gordievsky rebellious. It made him cautious. He did not protest. He did not speak. He observed. Back in Moscow, Gordievsky continued his work. Outwardly, nothing changed. He attended meetings, filed reports, advanced quietly. Inwardly, something fundamental had shifted. He began to notice contradictions he once ignored. Fear disguised as vigilance, control disguised as stability. Gordievsky did not yet see himself as opposed to the state. He saw himself as divided between what he had been taught and what he had seen. That division would grow, slowly, silently, until it could no longer be contained. And when that moment came, the system that raised him would no longer tolerate uncertainty, because in the Soviet world, doubt was not private, it was a threat. The first crack did not come from betrayal. It came from exposure. When Gordievsky arrived in Copenhagen, he did not feel as though he had entered enemy territory. There were no armed checkpoints, no visible surveillance, no sense of constant pressure. Denmark felt quiet, orderly, normal. And that normality was unsettling. Gordievsky had been trained to expect hostility. Instead, he found predictability. People spoke openly, moved freely, disagreed publicly, and nothing happened to them. At first, Gordievsky dismissed what he observed. Appearances could deceive. Western societies, he believed, hid their repression behind comfort and prosperity. But the longer he stayed, the harder that explanation became to maintain. The real disturbance did not come from politics. It came from access.
In Copenhagen, Gordievsky could walk into bookstores without restriction, libraries without supervision, universities without ideological screening. He could read history written from multiple perspectives, hear arguments unfold without predetermined conclusions, encounter contradiction. For someone raised inside a closed system, this was disorienting, not because the ideas were persuasive, but because they were allowed to exist. Comparison began quietly. Why were people not afraid of their own government? Why did criticism not carry consequences? Why did truth seem negotiable rather than enforced? These were not questions Gordievsky asked aloud. They lived silently in his mind, accumulating weight. Still, doubt alone did not break loyalty. Gordievsky did not defect. He did not reach out to Western intelligence. He continued to serve the KGB exactly as expected. He told himself that every system had flaws, that socialism, despite its excesses, remained morally superior. That belief held, barely. Then came 1968. That year, Soviet forces entered Czechoslovakia. Official explanations followed quickly. The intervention was necessary. Counter-revolution had been prevented. Socialism had been defended. But the images told a different story. Unarmed civilians confronting tanks, students standing in front of armored vehicles, a reform movement crushed by force. For Gordievsky, this moment mattered deeply. The Prague Spring was not capitalist, it was socialist. It was reform from within the system. Watching a socialist government destroy a socialist reform movement shattered a core assumption. If socialism required violence against its own people to survive, what exactly was being protected? This question had no safe answer. After Prague, Gordievsky did not become rebellious. He became observant. He began to notice how language shifted to justify power, how defense replaced suppression, how fear was reframed as vigilance. Back in Moscow, Gordievsky resumed his duties. Outwardly, nothing changed. He attended briefings, filed reports, advanced quietly. Inwardly, the crack widened. He saw paranoia where he once saw prudence, control where he once saw stability. Most striking was how deeply the system feared dissent. That fear was not incidental, it was structural. Gordievsky did not yet see himself as opposed to the state. He saw himself as divided, between belief and experience, between ideology and reality. That division did not demand action, not yet, but it demanded silence. In the Soviet system, silence was survival. So Gordievsky said nothing. He did not confide in colleagues. He did not test boundaries. He waited. And waiting, in intelligence work, is never passive. The moment that changed everything arrived quietly. One evening in Copenhagen, during a routine phone call, Gordievsky noticed something unusual, a faint delay, a distortion, a sound that should not have been there. At first, he dismissed it. Technical problems were common. Then it happened again, and again. Gordievsky understood the implication immediately. Someone was listening. If the KGB had begun monitoring him more closely, the approach would have been direct, aggressive, intimidating. This felt different. It felt patient, curious, deliberate. Western intelligence had noticed him. In intelligence work, attention is never accidental. It is an evaluation, and evaluation leads to options. For Gordievsky, this meant that the doubts he had carefully contained were no longer invisible.
Someone had recognized the gap between his outward loyalty and his inner conflict. Someone believed that gap could be widened.
Still, no approach came. No messages. No meetings. No coded invitations. Just time. Time designed to observe whether he would panic, whether he would react, whether he would expose himself. He did none of those things. He continued his work, maintained discipline, said nothing. And by doing so, he confirmed something essential. He was not impulsive. He was not reckless. He was exactly the kind of man intelligence services wait for. The choice had not yet arrived, but it was coming. And when it did, it would not feel dramatic. It would feel inevitable. Because the most dangerous moments in history are not marked by action. They are marked by realization. The realization that loyalty and truth have diverged, and that one must eventually be chosen.
Recruitment in intelligence rarely looks dramatic. There are no confrontations, no envelopes exchanged, no declarations of loyalty. What matters is timing and patience. When Western intelligence moved toward Gordievsky, it did so carefully, because the smallest mistake could expose him, and exposure would end everything. The first conversations were deliberately ordinary, neutral locations, unremarkable settings, moments that could be explained away as coincidence. No one used the word recruitment. No one spoke of betrayal. Instead, the conversations focused on observation, politics, ideology, contradictions. The British officers did not push, they listened, and listening told them everything they needed to know. Gordievsky was not angry, he was not desperate, he was conflicted. Years of internal restraint had shaped him. He had carried doubt without acting on it. He had not panicked, he had not sought attention, he had not made reckless moves. That discipline mattered. It marked him as reliable and dangerous. Only after trust was established did the tone shift, gradually, almost imperceptibly. Questions became more precise. Topics narrowed. Still, there was no demand. The British understood something crucial. A man like Gordievsky could not be forced. He had to choose. When the choice was finally presented, it was framed without illusion. No immunity, no guarantees, no heroic rescue if things went wrong. If Gordievsky agreed, his life would not become easier, it would become smaller. Every movement would be observed. Every relationship would carry risk. Every mistake could be fatal. Most importantly, his family would remain in the Soviet Union. There would be no immediate extraction, no clean break. This was not an offer designed to tempt. It was designed to test resolve. The British made one thing clear. They were not interested in volume. They were interested in judgment. They did not want every document. They wanted what mattered: intent, assumptions, fear. Gordievsky listened carefully. He asked precise questions: how information would be transmitted, how contact would be managed, what would happen if communication failed. He did not ask about money. He did not ask about protection. Those omissions mattered. When Gordievsky agreed, there was no ceremony, no handshake, no formal acknowledgement, just an understanding. From that moment on, everything changed. He would live two lives, one visible, one invisible. Operational discipline became absolute. Contact was irregular. Information transferred through brief encounters, moments designed to leave no trace. Nothing was written unnecessarily. Nothing was repeated. Memory became essential. The psychological strain was immediate. Gordievsky could not relax, could not confide, could not speak freely, even in private. Every glance felt loaded, every silence intentional. The KGB trained its officers to detect deception. Now Gordievsky had to deceive the very institution that trained him. Yet he did not see himself as a traitor, not in the way the Soviet system defined it. He believed he was serving something more basic: truth. That belief did not make the work easier. It made it heavier. The British understood this burden. They did not flatter him. They did not inspire him with ideology. They treated him as a professional,
And in return, Gordievsky provided something rare, not just information, interpretation. He explained how reports were shaped, which conclusions were sincere, which were written to satisfy expectation. He translated not just language, but mindset. Over time, his value became clear. He was not passing isolated facts. He was revealing how decisions were formed. This was intelligence of the highest order, and it came at immense personal cost.
Every day, Gordievsky returned home knowing discovery would be final. No trial, no explanation, only disappearance. Still, he continued, because withdrawing would not erase what he knew. It would only ensure no one else knew it. The British remained cautious. They did not push him too far. They understood that longevity mattered more than speed. Then came the reassignment. Gordievsky was posted to London again, this time not as a junior officer, but as a senior representative of Soviet intelligence. It was a position of access, influence, extraordinary risk. From that moment on, Gordievsky was no longer observing the system. He was inside it, and as Cold War tensions intensified, the information moving through his hands would soon carry consequences far beyond espionage. Consequences measured not in careers, but in lives. From the moment Gordievsky returned to Moscow, his life divided cleanly in two. There was the man the KGB saw, and the man who understood what the system could not see in itself. Outwardly, Gordievsky remained exemplary. He followed procedures, attended meetings, filed reports that reflected institutional expectations. Nothing about his behavior invited suspicion. Internally, the strain began immediately. Every word spoken in meetings had to be calibrated, every report crafted to appear orthodox. He learned to speak in the language of conformity, not as performance, but as survival. Gordievsky understood how intelligence reports evolved inside the Soviet system. Raw information mattered less than alignment. Facts that reinforced existing assumptions traveled upward easily. Contradictions stalled. Over time, this produced a dangerous effect. Leadership began to hear only what it expected. Gordievsky recognized this distortion early. He began transmitting not just information to the British, but interpretation. Which assessments were sincere, which were written to avoid punishment, which fears were exaggerated to justify resources. This context was invaluable. In London, Western intelligence did not receive isolated facts. They received clarity. Clarity about how Soviet leadership perceived the world. And that perception was shaped by fear. The Soviet Union did not see itself as dominant. It saw itself as surrounded. Hostile forces, unpredictable intentions, historical memory of invasion. This fear intensified in the late 1970s and early 1980s. NATO military exercises increased in scale. New weapons systems were introduced. Communication between blocs deteriorated. Within the KGB, these developments were interpreted not as deterrence, but as preparation. Gordievsky reported something alarming. Soviet leadership increasingly believed that a nuclear attack could come without warning, not after escalation, but suddenly. This belief shaped everything. Analysts were instructed to search for signs of imminent war, diplomatic gestures, military movements, even economic fluctuations. All were reinterpreted as potential indicators. This was not paranoia at the edges. It was policy. The KGB formalized this worldview through Operation Ryan. Its objective was to detect early signs of a Western first strike. In practice, it institutionalized fear. Every observation was filtered through the assumption of hostility. False positives multiplied. Signals were misread. Routine actions took on catastrophic meaning. Gordievsky understood the danger immediately. If both sides prepared for war based on worst-case assumptions, miscalculation became inevitable. He began warning the British, not with speculation, with detail. He explained how reports were written, how pressure flowed downward, how fear shaped analysis. This information changed how Western intelligence interpreted Soviet reactions. What once looked aggressive now appeared defensive. What seemed irrational became comprehensible. But comprehension did not guarantee restraint. As tensions escalated, Gordievsky's position became more precarious. He had access to sensitive discussions, and that access increased scrutiny. Every promotion carried risk. Every responsibility narrowed margins. Yet Gordievsky did not withdraw.
He understood that retreat would raise suspicion. Visibility had to be managed, not avoided. His life settled into a pattern of constant vigilance. No habits, no routines, no emotional release. The smallest inconsistency could expose everything. What sustained him was not ideology, it was necessity. If he stopped transmitting, the West would lose its clearest window into Soviet fear. And fear, when misunderstood, was the most dangerous weapon of all.
By the early 1980s, fear had become systemic. It no longer belonged to individuals, it belonged to institutions. Soviet leadership did not believe war was inevitable. They believed it was possible, and that possibility demanded constant vigilance. Every NATO exercise was analyzed for hidden intent, every diplomatic statement examined for deception. Even silence became suspicious. Within the KGB, analysts were encouraged to err on the side of alarm. A false warning was safer than a missed one. This logic fed itself. As reports became more alarming, leadership became more anxious. As leadership became more anxious, analysts faced greater pressure. The feedback loop tightened. Gordievsky observed this process from inside. He saw how fear migrated upward, how uncertainty hardened into doctrine. Operation Ryan expanded. Stations across the world were instructed to report on obscure indicators, changes in blood supply, movements of political leaders, unusual activity near military facilities. Individually, these indicators meant little. Together, they created the illusion of preparation. The West did not see this escalation clearly. From NATO's perspective, military exercises were routine. Deterrence required visibility. Transparency was meant to prevent misunderstanding. But transparency only works when both sides interpret signals similarly. Gordievsky understood that they did not. He warned the British repeatedly. Soviet leadership believed the West was rehearsing for a real strike, not publicly, privately, quietly. This belief was not universal. There were dissenting voices, but dissent carried risk. Analysts who downplayed threats were seen as complacent, or worse. In such an environment, alarm became the safe position. By 1983, tensions reached a critical level. The downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007 deepened distrust. NATO announced Able Archer, a command post exercise simulating nuclear release procedures. To Western planners, Able Archer was routine. To Soviet analysts, it looked different. The exercise included new elements: realistic communication, simulating transitions to nuclear readiness. These details mattered. They aligned too closely with Soviet expectations of a surprise attack. Within the KGB, concern intensified. Some Soviet forces quietly increased readiness, not as preparation for war, but as precaution. Precaution, however, narrowed decision time. If misinterpreted, it could become escalation. Gordievsky transmitted everything he could. He emphasized urgency. He explained how Soviet leadership was interpreting Able Archer, not as training, but as possible cover. This information reached Western decision-makers, and for the first time they understood how close misunderstanding had brought them to catastrophe. The West adjusted. Exercises were scaled back. Rhetoric softened. Channels reopened. These changes were subtle, unannounced, but effective. War did not come. Not because deterrence worked as designed, but because someone inside the system had explained how deterrence was being misread. Gordievsky did not know this at the time. He only knew that fear was peaking, and that his own position was becoming increasingly dangerous. The more accurate his reporting, the more indispensable he became. And indispensability is not protection. It is exposure.
The moment passed without headlines. No public announcement, no visible shift. But inside intelligence circles, something critical had changed. Western leaders now understood that the Soviet Union was not preparing to attack, it was preparing not to be attacked. That distinction mattered. For decades, Cold War strategy assumed rational deterrence. Each side would avoid escalation because the consequences were unthinkable. Gordievsky's reporting exposed a flaw in that assumption. Deterrence only works when fear is symmetrical. In 1983, it was not. The West believed stability was holding. The Soviet leadership believed disaster could arrive without warning. This imbalance created danger, because a system expecting surprise becomes prone to preemption. Gordievsky continued to warn British intelligence. He explained how Soviet analysts interpreted silence as concealment, how restraint was mistaken for preparation, how defensive measures were seen as rehearsals. These interpretations did not reflect reality, but they shaped decision-making. Inside the KGB, suspicion deepened. Leadership demanded certainty where none existed. Ambiguity became unacceptable. Analysts were pressed to deliver conclusions, and conclusions, once written, acquired authority. Gordievsky watched as the system hardened. He saw how fear crowded out skepticism, how loyalty suppressed doubt. This environment narrowed margins for error. One misinterpreted signal, one delayed clarification, one unexpected movement, any of these could trigger irreversible decisions. Gordievsky understood that his role had shifted. He was no longer simply providing intelligence, he was acting as a stabilizer. By explaining Soviet fear to the West, he allowed restraint to replace assumption. This was not heroism, it was damage control. But damage control mattered, because in nuclear strategy, avoiding catastrophe often means preventing momentum, not stopping an attack, but preventing belief in one. As Able Archer ended without incident, tension eased, not immediately, gradually. Fear receded just enough. Gordievsky's information had done its work. Yet success carried its own cost. The KGB did not conclude that fear had been exaggerated. It concluded that penetration was possible. Someone had to be responsible for the misreading. Someone had failed. Internal reviews began quietly. Not accusations, inquiries. Patterns were examined. Access reconsidered. Gordievsky noticed subtle changes.